Labour has never done well in a UK election without doing really well in Scotland.
We need deposit ATMs and we need withdrawal ATMs, and we need a law that means that businesses have to accept cash.
UK workers have had the most bargaining power essentially since the 1970s because the jobs market is so tight.
Can Britain actually afford to maintain a global military presence?
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. And this was the 11th of July 2016.
We'll have a new Prime Minister in that building behind me by Wednesday evening. Thank you very much.
Is this a sad day, Prime Minister?
Right.
So that was David Cameron humming a tune after resigning in 2016 when the Brexit referendum did not go his way. Now he's back as Foreign Secretary. Cameron was pictured only yesterday at Remembrance Sunday events. 7 living former Prime Ministers were there side by side. Now he's back in office. Because he wasn't an MP or a Lord, he's then been conferred a barony for life by King Charles.
It's hard to think, looking at that picture yesterday, that we thought these were all people of ghosts of politics past, as it were, and now one of them very much back in the present. In his statement after being appointed, David Cameron said he hoped his experience as Conservative leader for 11 years and Prime Minister for 6 will assist him in helping the Prime Minister to meet the vital foreign policy challenges that the UK faces. He did also acknowledge, though, that he hasn't always seen eye to eye with Rishi Sunak, saying that though I may have disagreed with some individual decisions, it's clear to me that Rishi Sunak is a strong and capable Prime Minister who is showing exemplary leadership at a difficult time.
Well, the least surprising of this morning's events, today's events, was that Suella Braverman has been sacked. Rishi Sunak fired her after she defied his authority over the handling of pro-Palestinian marches in the UK. She was accused of emboldening a far-right counter-protest which turned violent on Saturday in London. In her statement, Suella Braverman ominously say, "I will have more to say in due course." James Cleverly is now replacing her as Home Secretary.
It's odd to think that the resignation of a Home Secretary is playing second fiddle, but the re-emergence onto the political scene of David Cameron, I think, is the story to focus on today. We were discussing this a little bit earlier with Will Walden, who's Edelman's Senior Counsel for Strategic Communications. He was also Chief Counsel and Communications Director to former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for many years. He helped to run the 2019 campaign. He says the reshuffle is a power move by Sunak.
I think what it says about Rishi Sunak's leadership and what he's particularly saying to Suella Braverman and the right of the Tory party is, I'm the Prime Minister, I'm in charge, back in your box. And I think it was inevitable once she went too far with the column last week. You can't challenge the authority of a Prime Minister like that and not risk being sacked. And I think it was inevitable from the moment that she didn't make the changes at number 10 and the Prime Minister wanted, because what that said to the Prime Minister was, I'm not listening. And I think if you have collective cabinet responsibility and you have the Prime Minister first among equals, but essentially in charge, you can't challenge his authority like that. So I think from that point, it was inevitable. He will have... He's a way up kind of guy. I think there were people that thought, you can't let her get away with this. She should have gone when she wrote the column last week. And now it looks like he's bowing to political pressure. I don't think Rishi Sunak is that sort of character. I think he weighs up decisions. He's clearly been mulling a reshuffle for a while, and he waited to see how that would fit into this. He probably made the decision last week that it was inevitable she was going to go, but he's weighed up that factor over the weekend. He's had a look at how the protests played out, and he's decided that he needs to stamp his authority on the Conservative Party.
So that was Will Walden saying that firing Braverman shows strength. I mean, that argument is sometimes a difficult one to make, that, you know, weighing things up is a better course of action. The decision not to fire her on Wednesday, though, when the Times piece was published, had already led to accusations of weakness. And we spoke on Friday's programme to Tony Blair's former political secretary, John McTernan, who spelled out the problem like this.
In politics, in a crisis, there's a universal law, which is you should do quickly what you're going to be forced to do slowly. And he's going to be forced slowly to sack her. So if you're going to be if that's going to be the end game, do it now. Do it as quick as you can to give yourself... He's got a weak hand, but it doesn't mean you have to play a weak hand weakly. You can play a weak hand strongly. That's the essence of poker. It's the essence of politics.
We're joined now by Bloomberg's senior government reporter Alex Wickham and by David Merritt, head of Bloomberg Media Editorial and also co-host of his own podcast, In the City podcast. Welcome to both of you to discuss what has been, another dramatic day in UK politics. Alex, just how much was Sunak's hand forced to make the decision finally to sort of fire Suella Braverman?
He was forced. I mean, he was left in a pretty horrible situation, having to basically decide, shall I have a big fight with the right wing of my party by getting rid of their standard bearer, or do I make myself look incredibly weak by keeping her? He decided that looking weak would be worse, and he's got rid. I mean, absolutely extraordinary day. I sort of hesitate to use words like that because we sort of journalists tend to say things like that all the time, but it really is. Nobody saw David Cameron's comeback coming. The man who, we kind of last saw whistling his way into number 10 as he lost the Brexit referendum, and all of a sudden, out of absolutely nowhere, he's back on the front line as Britain's top diplomat. I mean, it is almost unbelievable.
I think you're allowed an extraordinary and an almost unbelievable, given it is day like today. I mean, Dave, what's your take on this? The idea that David Cameron comes back to rescue Rishi Sunak seems like an unlikely narrative in the storybook of Tales of the Conservative Party.
It is. It's a bit of a risk, isn't it? I mean, there's the surprise factor, as Alex said. Nobody's seeing this coming. There was sort of collective jaws on the floor seeing him walk in to Downing Street. So there's that kind of political surprise. But then there's what it symbolises in terms of the overall direction of this government. Suella Braverman, as Alex said, a bit of a standard bearer for the right wing of the party. But not only is she out of the government, but somebody is now in who stood for the kind of centrist One Nation approach. Was credited, of course, with kind of detoxifying the Conservative Party when he became leader, and has got a pretty good electoral record. Remember, he won a majority in 2015. He unseated Labour in 2010. So he was popular at the ballot box. Of course, the Brexit referendum blew up his career, but that was now 7 years ago. So I guess the bet from Rishi Sunak will be that enough time has passed, maybe to for the public to think a bit more favourably about David Cameron and see him as an asset for the election that's to come.
Alex, dare I ask what's in your WhatsApp groups today, and what are Conservative MPs telling you?
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say this appointment of David Cameron is not universally popular in the Conservative Party. To be fair, there is the One Nation group of sort of centrist Tories. They are happy. People like Damien Green and Simon Hoare, backbenchers who represent the sort of middle ground of the Tory party, they're delighted by this. The right wing is much less happy, and they're pointing out things like that literally 3 or 4 weeks ago, David Cameron was very angrily criticising the government for cancelling, the HS2 project that he championed as Prime Minister. At the same time, Rishi Sunak in his party conference speech just a month ago was really piling into 30 years of failure from his predecessors, and how Sunak was saying he's the guy who understands what all the rest of them got wrong, and he's going to be the change candidate who makes the difference. Well, we've moved from change to, perhaps let's bring back the old guy, which is a little bit incoherent, perhaps to put it politely. I mean, there are other issues as well. There's things like David Cameron's private sector work over the last few years, where he's essentially been a lobbyist for clients around the world. How does that conflict with his role as Foreign Secretary? So you can see there might be issues down the track. And also, there is I have to say, there is the Brexit element. Yes, you can see some blue wall voters, middle classes, centrists in the south of England sort of going, David Cameron was all right, really, as an elder statesman coming back. But actually quite a lot of Remainers blame Cameron for Brexit. Was it a reckless decision? Did he not do the Remain campaign properly? Is he the reason why we're out of the EU? And Brexiteers, obviously, not Cameron's biggest fan.
Yeah. So the issue of bringing David Cameron back is absolutely huge. But a word on Suella Braverman being replaced by James Cleverly. I mean, how is his approach going to differ to hers? I mean, Cleverly is seen much more as a safe pair of hands. Alex, the rhetoric as well, we'll have a word on that in a moment too, but just in terms of James Cleverly as the replacement, that's kind of been lost in all of this in a way.
Yeah, which again was another unexpected move. James Cleverly very happy as Foreign Secretary and doing a relatively decent job by comparison perhaps to other ministers in their own roles. Yeah, exactly. I think we'll see dialed down rhetoric from James Cleverly on things like immigration and the Palestine protests of the last few weeks, certainly compared to Suella Braverman. I think he'll be a little bit frustrated not to be Foreign Secretary anymore. Foreign Secretary is a great job. You get to fly around the world. You get to deal with huge crises in the Middle East and Russia and present yourself as a big statesman. Home Office, much harder job of dealing with some of the trickiest issues that the government has to solve. However, James Cleverly is the sort of current favourite to be the next Tory leader after the election. He'll now be able to say, I've held two of the great offices of state, and that doesn't put him in a bad position politically.
Of course, the departure of Suella Braverman does also take out one of the, I suppose, most controversial members of the cabinet, but also someone who stood for a hard line on immigration and populist language around the issue of migration. Let's take a listen to Suella Braverman's speech at Tory party conference.
One of the most powerful forces reshaping our world is unprecedented mass migration. The wind of change that carried my own parents across the globe in the 20th century was a mere gust compared to the hurricane that is coming.
Dave, that speech got an awful lot of attention for that language being used in it. Does this give the government an opportunity to perhaps move away from positions like that, or is it just going to be a question of it'll be a different face and they'll find somebody else to say those sorts of things?
Well, Suella Braverman might not be the Home Secretary anymore, but she's not actually disappearing completely. And I think she said,
as
in
she
her
warned
statement,
us, I will have more to say.
There's going to be more to say, right? And we've seen this with Liz Truss, of course, didn't we? Whose fall from office was so dramatic. She was back at the Tory conference making big speeches and drawing big crowds. So, the theory with Suella had always been slightly to keep her in cabinet, to kind of keep that wing of the party in check. And the risk now is that she will be even more off the reservation, as it were, and prone to make these sort of provocative statements. And the question is, how loud is she going to be? And how many people in the Conservative Party, both the parliamentary party, but more broadly, sort of rally to her cause and see her as a potential future leader if Rishi Sunak stumbles at the next election?
So, Alex, in terms of one of the issues with Suella Braverman in and of itself was the language around the Metropolitan Police, the protests that have gone on every weekend. How is the government going to handle that? Everybody was worried about an escalation in tensions or clashes. There were lots more arrests over the weekend. What does it mean for next weekend if the protests continue? And how's the government going to deal with this now? Yeah,
I think it's important to say that just because Suella Braverman's left the government, it doesn't mean that Rishi Sunak's suddenly a rabid lefty and all the rest of it. He is going to take a harder line over the next few days on these pro-Palestine protests particularly. Downing Street officials have briefed us that over the last 24 hours. We are going to see essentially new guidance from the Prime Minister to the Metropolitan Police to say, we don't like chants that say the following words, we don't like placards and slogans that say the following things, we expect you to arrest these people, we expect more of a clampdown and more proactive policing than we've had over the last few weeks. Because while this weekend's demonstrations, the violence was largely committed, it looks like, by far-right protesters, the government in particular is very upset about the level of anti-Semitism that it sees as taking place among the Palestine demonstrators, and you will see more even without Suella Braverman. You will see more in the next few days from Rishi Sunak on that.
Dave, can I ask you about the sort of global perceptions of Britain with David Cameron as Foreign Secretary? Is this going to put a new front on Britain's foreign policy?
Yes, I think you've got to expect that, right? I mean, he was Prime Minister for 6 years. It feels like an age, right, on the current form. So built up relations around the world. Remember, one of his key priorities as Prime Minister was the relationship with China. I think he and Osborne billed it as a golden era. We had President Xi visiting the UK. Now, the world feels very different now, and the relations between China and Europe and the United States have deteriorated a lot since then. But will there be more of a kind of push to have more constructive economic relations with the Chinese government, especially in an election year, both here and the United States. That's one key thing to look at. And of course, with the rest of the European Union, Rishi Sunak has made progress in kind of lowering the temperature. We've had the Windsor framework. Relations with the EU are kind of on a better footing now than they have been since the vote, arguably, in 2016. So how does he want to push that agenda forward in terms of closeness to the European Union amid these big geopolitical problems that the world is facing? And David Cameron himself in his statement this morning mentioned those, of course, the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East. And there was this tone of, the times we're in are very serious. And that's part of the kind of messaging, I think, to have someone with his experience stepping up into that role at this time.
Yeah, it'll be a very, very interesting moment, won't it? Of course, thank you to both of you for joining us to discuss. Bloomberg senior government reporter Alex Wickham and David Merritt, head of Bloomberg Media Editorial, co-host of the In the City podcast. So, Suella Braverman, 13 months as Home Secretary, now out, her second stint. But yes, the turnover of ministers remains pretty speedy.
Well, joining us now is Gavin Megaw, President and Managing Director of the Communications Group Hanover. He also worked for the Conservative Party in the early 2000s as well. Gavin, great to have you with us on the programme. What's your view then on today's events? Was this something that Rishi Sunak had any choice in, do you think?
Well, he had lots of choices, and he's had lots of choices over the last few months. It's interesting what has happened, though. It surprised everyone. No one would have thought David Cameron would be joining the government as Foreign Secretary today. And anyone who says they did were lying. Obviously, we all thought Suella would go. It's been due for a while. Her actions last week were extraordinary and completely out of order for a Home Secretary. But today has seen a big change to try and take the news away from that and try and push it towards Rishi's view that he is forming a serious government for the times. Now, I don't think the country will necessarily see it as that. It's a much more difficult scenario that he faces today, but it's an interesting move for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of David Cameron, he was controversial in and of himself, leading the Brexit vote, and then afterwards his advisory role when it came to Greensill Capital. Do you think that appointing Cameron, who I saw an image of course, on Remembrance Sunday, along with all of the former prime ministers lined up for that day of national remembrance, do you think it's going to help the government, hinder the government? What do we know about his popularity?
Well, I think there's two different things here, aren't there? So undoubtedly, having someone of Cameron's prestige on the international stage will help from a diplomatic perspective at a time when geopolitical risk is on the rise. But we can't separate that from day-to-day politics. And I really do question on the day-to-day politics side whether this helps Rishi. He was pushing the whole change manifesto at his party conference a few weeks ago. Now he's bringing back the guy who is probably the most successful Tory Prime Minister of recent years for sure, but is also, we've got Brexit, as you say, we've got a number of domestic foreign policy areas, plus a few issues like Greensill, which have happened since. He will have to, David Cameron, he will have to be ring-fenced purely to foreign affairs, because unless that happens, we will see clash after clash over him seeking to protect his legacy and Rishi Sunak seeking to show that he's a change Prime Minister who has got more change to bring should he have a chance to form a new government after the next election, which I think all of us think is incredibly unlikely.
Gavin, you're an expert in messaging, and I want to know what you think Rishi Sunak should be doing now to sell these changes.
Oh, he'll undoubtedly focus on bringing in a grown-up for a really difficult diplomatic crises. That's fine, and that is the right thing to do. I think, though, these things are often done quickly, and then they are unravelled over a period of weeks and months. And I think you will see the Labour Party focusing in on David Cameron's legacy as much as they can. They will focus in on asking lots of issues about those outstanding issues around Greensill, etc. And also, David Cameron's been out doing lots of speeches to different bodies over the last few years, making some money, and all of that's going to come back now. All of those questions will come to the forefront because he is the Foreign Secretary, and it's fair play to ask ask those questions suddenly. So the messaging which is being created today about the grown-ups in charge of diplomatic relations may well unravel very, very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. He's done business in China and so on. I'm sure there'll be many questions about, aspects of his legacy and also sort of post-parliamentary time. In terms of Suella Braverman, though, I mean, what she has said on various topics has been quite incendiary. It always has been. What do you think changed to make this the kind of decisive moment?
I think over the weekend we saw a lot of Tory MPs who are the real constituency here for Rishi Sunak. He's trapped into a party which is on its last legs. He's trying to hold a broad coalition together within that party. But the Tory MPs over the weekend, I think many of them lost faith with Braverman, which gave Rishi the opening to do what he wanted to do. He still looks weak, though. He should have dealt with this a while ago. Her judgment has been under question, not just last week, but for weeks. You know, the comments over homelessness, last week's comments were just extraordinary, really, from a Home Secretary in regard to policing at a time when it was a tinderbox situation. It was not easy for the police to prepare for the weekend, and she was making it more difficult. And that sort of judgment is what has been at the heart of this. It was poor judgment to allow her to be in that post. It was poor judgment she showed in that post with her comments over the years, or over the months, sorry, I should say. And it's those poor judgments has led directly to this action. It has come too late, though. And Rishi Sunak will be hoping that trying to show new, better judgment in terms of the diplomatic needs for the Middle East might get him out of this. But I think it's very, very difficult. I do think the James Cleverly appointment is very smart ahead of the Rwanda decision on Wednesday, because he's a good communicator, I think, and he's seen as a good communicator by number 10, and they will hope that he'll be able to provide a path forward on that front.
Do you see him likely as taking up the mantle of the sort of commentary that we heard from Suella Braverman, that extreme kind of hardline comments around migration into the UK? Will James Cleverly be following in a similar line?
I think they've sort of trapped themselves into a hard line on this. It won't necessarily be as emotive as Suella Braverman, but I think the Tories have got themselves in a position where they have one approach on this. They believe it works. You know, I personally have an issue with that, but they believe it works, and they will be seeking to exploit any opportunity to differentiate their position from that of the Labour Party going forward. And they will see this Wednesday as an opportunity rather than a problem, I would think, because they are so hardline on this front. And they would claim it aligns with what the electorate wants. I often think, though, you have to lead people together in a way, in a positive way, rather than seek to inflame and create division. And that's kind of the trap that we've seen them falling into recently. It's very easy for political strategists to say this will get you 1% extra votes in certain areas. It's much harder to find a position which can bring the nation together behind and which needs tough leadership. And I think that's what's lacking with them. But from where they are, they will probably see Wednesday as an opportunity to win votes rather than lose them.
When it comes to the difficult issue of the Middle East, though, how do you think that Rishi Sunak is going to handle the protests going forward? I mean, if you want to draw a comparison, you could over the weekend between the protests against anti-Semitism that took place in Paris and pro-Palestinian protests in the UK. You know, this is a hugely difficult issue for the UK, for Europe to deal with. How do you think the government is going to deal with that going forwards? Because although the language is inflammatory, how much of a gap is there between what Rishi Sunak believes on the Middle East versus Suella Braverman? You know, the language sort of aside, in terms of policy, how does the government deal with protests and with the Middle East now and its impact on the UK?
Well, I think there's two separate things here, aren't there? There's their foreign policy in relation to the Middle East and what they want to happen there and how they see this conflict sort of quietening over the next few months or years, if that's even possible, by the way, because you look at it at present, it looks terrible and you don't see a way out. But there will be a foreign policy perspective. And then you have a domestic policy perspective in terms of policing, and in terms of how they're going to handle these marches and these protests. And my fear is actually what we saw over the weekend, the counter-protests will become more and more the norm again. And, you know, it's so depressing to watch over the weekend. People on both sets of protests saying things and doing things which we just do not think fits in a democratic country. And I think everyone should have the chance to protest, but they should do it in the right way. And I think that's what Rishi Sunak and his team are going to have to really get to. How do we allow that to happen? Because if you start breaking down the ability of people to protest on the streets of the UK, then you really, really are going in the wrong direction, I would say, when your message is we're trying to protect freedom.
Okay, Gavin Megaw, President and Managing Director of the Communications Group, Hanover, thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Wilcock and Tiwa Adebayo, and our audio engineer was Marifal Hussain. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.